I have watched this farm grow food for 60 years. No fertilizer bags, no spray rigs, no deliveries from the co-op, just the same dark, heavy soil, getting darker and heavier every single season. 10,000 pounds of vegetables a year, off a plot most modern growers would call too small to bother with. When I was young, I thought it was luck or some particular gift of that family's land. I watched for decades before I understood what I was actually seeing. It was not luck, it was a system, quietly built, carefully kept, and almost entirely forgotten outside these communities. Stay with me, because what I am about to show you took me most of a lifetime to fully understand. And once you see it, you will never look at a bag of fertilizer the same way again. Modern agriculture is built on a transaction. You take from the soil, you put something back in a bag. You take again. The Old Order Amish never accepted that transaction. What I watched my neighbors do across 8 decades of observation was something fundamentally different. They did not feed their plants, they fed their soil. That distinction sounds simple. It is not. When you feed your plants, you are solving a short-term problem. The plant gets nitrogen, it grows, you harvest. The soil underneath is no richer than it was the season before, sometimes poorer. When you feed your soil, you are building something. Season after season, the biology underneath gets more complex, more active, more capable. The soil feeds the plant on its own terms. Your job is just to keep feeding the soil. The family I watched most closely, I will not use their name, but their farm sits on a road I have driven for 60 years, built their soil the same way their grandparents did. They composted everything, straw from the barn, manure from the horses and the chickens, kitchen scraps, spent garden plants, leaves raked from the orchard in October. Nothing left the property as waste. Everything cycled back. That closed loop is the foundation. Before you understand any of the specific methods, you have to understand that principle. The farm feeds itself. The moment you start buying inputs, you have broken the loop. Be honest with yourself right now. Now, how much of what leaves your garden actually comes back to it? Drop a number in the comments. I am curious what people are actually doing out there. The compost pile is where most people start, and it is where most people stop making progress, because they treat it like a passive pile rather than an active system. What I watched on these farms was a 3-stage process running continuously 12 months a year. The first stage is collection. Every day, material goes in. Horse manure from the barn. And horse manure matters here because horses do not fully digest their feed the way cattle do. So their manure arrives already rich with partially broken down plant fiber. Chicken manure for nitrogen, straw for carbon. The ratio the old order kept was roughly 3 parts carbon material to 1 part nitrogen material. That is not a guess. That is what I watched them build forkload by forkload across decades. The second stage is turning, not weekly, not monthly. Every 3 to 4 days during active decomposition. I have watched these men turn a compost pile the way a baker folds dough, with a rhythm and an attention that tells you they know exactly what they are looking for. Heat in the core. Moisture throughout, smell that is earthy, not sharp. The third stage is finishing. Finished compost on these farms sits for a minimum of 60 days before it touches the garden. Not because someone read that in a book, because 2 centuries of barn observation showed that half-finished compost burns roots and ties up nitrogen in the soil rather than releasing it. The result, applied at roughly 2 inches deep across the garden beds each spring, delivers everything the soil needs. No blood meal, no bone meal, no bags from the farm store. If this is landing differently than you expected, leave a like. It helps more people find this kind of depth. The growing season ends in October. On a modern farm, the beds go bare. On the farms I watched, the work of the next season began the same week the last harvest came in. Cover crops, winter rye, planted immediately after the final harvest. Crimson clover, where the heavy feeders, the corn, the squash, the brassicas, had grown hardest. The rye holds the soil through winter, prevents erosion, and when it is turned under in spring, it adds a fresh layer of organic matter. The clover fixes nitrogen directly from the air into the soil. That last part is worth pausing on. Leguminous cover crops, clover, vetch, Field peas carry bacteria in their root nodules that pull nitrogen gas out of the atmosphere and convert it into a form the soil can use. The Old Order did not call it nitrogen fixation. They called it resting the ground the right way. But the biology is exactly the same thing university extension offices have been recommending for 40 years. The barns knew it first. The rotation I watched on these farms followed a pattern. Heavy feeders one season, cover crop the next, light feeders or root vegetables the season after. Nothing grew in the same spot 2 years running. The soil never got the chance to become depleted in any single nutrient because the demands on it shifted every year. Most people will hear this and think it sounds complicated. It is not. It is a calendar. Once you build it, you follow it. The farms I watched ran this rotation without written records. It was carried in memory, passed from parent to child, preserved across generations because it worked. Here is where I want to be careful. Because when I tell people what I have watched these farms produce, the first response is usually doubt. 10,000 pounds of vegetables from roughly half an acre of intensively managed garden ground. That is not a number I invented. That is what I watched come off a single family's plot, documented in their own records, which they shared with me across years of conversation. Half an acre, managed with no purchased inputs, no synthetic fertilizer, no pesticides, no irrigation infrastructure beyond hand-carried water, and, on the larger properties, a gravity-fed line from a hillside cistern. How is that yield possible without fertilizer? Because the soil is not depleted. That is the entire answer. A soil with active biology, with auftan, with earthworms, with fungal networks, with bacteria processing organic matter continuously, delivers nutrients to plant roots more efficiently than any synthetic program. The plants are not fighting the soil. They are working with it. Experienced growers who have made the transition from synthetic programs will tell you the same thing. The first 2 years are the hardest, because you are rebuilding biology that industrial inputs suppressed. By year 3, the soil starts doing work you did not ask it to do. By year 5, you are producing yields that do not make sense on paper, until you understand what is living underneath. That is what I have watched across 8 decades. Not a trick, not a secret, a system, quietly carried forward by families who never stopped believing that the ground properly kept would keep feeding them back. If you know someone who is still buying fertilizer every season and wondering why their yields are not improving, send them this video. This is the conversation they need to have. What I just walked you through, the closed loop, the compost system, the cover crop calendar, that is the foundation. And what is coming next is the part that took me the longest to understand. How these farms maintain this system across generations without it breaking down. If the depth of what we are doing here is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing takes 1 second. This is what we do. Old systems explained carefully by someone who watched them work. You have stayed with this long enough to understand that what I am describing is not nostalgia. It is a working system that outlived the alternatives. If you want more of this, the heating systems, the water systems, the food preservation methods these families kept building when the English moved on, it is all here. Subscribe, and you will not miss any of it. The ground, properly kept, will keep feeding you back. That is not a philosophy. That is what I watched for 60 years. And it is still working on every farm that never stopped doing it. Thanks for watching. The end screen has more videos in the same world. Pick whichever video on the end screen calls to you. There is more here worth your time.